o'clock.
Okay.
All right.
Welcome to our dialogue panel. I don't actually remember the specific formal name for the dialogue
The
panel.
official name is Good and Bad Dialogue. I originally wanted to have the do's and don'ts of dialogue, but I changed the title of it.
Yeah, we've had do's and don'ts panels. So what we're doing is a dialogue-specific panel, something that will talk about all the ways that we can have these ponies talking to each other. And our first little agenda item, to start right off, is purpose of dialogue, which seems like a very easy question. It's like, okay, so why have dialogue? Let's just have all the ponies doing other things. No, maybe not. I have a key point for purpose of dialogue to start right off, and then my voice is so shot that we're going to be turning it over to Lunatone for a lot of this. He's well capable of handling most of this stuff. We agreed in talking earlier about how we were going to go over this panel and the stuff we were going to cover, that the greatest thing about having dialogue is that it is a way of showing multiple viewpoints that are not the author's. That is very important because the first sin of bad fic writing is you're writing the fic, your narrative style, your non-dialogue stuff, basically, descriptions and things like that, your authorial perspective is of one particular direction, and then your characters all basically echo what you think, or maybe they're just sort of puppets parroting dumb things for being evil or whatever because they're a villain. If you can convincingly show multiple viewpoints and they are clashing with each other, that is the most powerful thing you can have in your story, because that means your characters are going to start talking to each other, and that's when they start writing your story for you and it starts becoming really good.
Yes, and normally when I start to write dialogue, I ask myself 3 important questions. Why am I writing this dialogue? Is it relevant to the character? And is it relevant to the story? Realistically, when you write dialogue, it's for 3 reasons. It's to introduce new information about the story, to show characterization, and to show where you want the plot to go. And assuming that you know what your plot is, your dialogue can really move it forward. And depending on where you are in your story, dialogue can be an extremely efficient method of giving your story direction. And what do I mean by that? If you consider your plot, you have to realize that your plot is your conflict. And if you have 2 characters with 2 different point of views on a specific subjective topic, that can really lead to a lot of conflict, and it can show the contrast between the 2 characters. And that is really what you want in your dialogue. You want the dialogue to move the story forward. If you just have useless dialogue that is just hanging there, then you should step back and ask yourself, why do I have this dialogue here? Is it relevant? Am I just putting this in because I don't know what to write? If that is the case, then you should probably revise it.
I mean, stalling for time is a kind of dialogue that you can have, but it contains an intention. You can have dialogue that's really boring or goes nowhere, and it contains an intention because, say, the pony that's talking is trying to distract from something else happening, or you're trying to convey that they have no thoughts in their head and they don't know what they're doing. The dialogue is a flag to the intentions of the characters and what they're trying to accomplish, and that's where your conflict and stuff that Lunatone was talking about comes from. It's a very effective way of telegraphing what the character wants, and to make the reader understand what the character wants is a powerful, powerful tool.
And incidentally, depending on how deep you take this with dialogue, you can connect it to many different elements within stories, such as theme. If you have themes in your story, you can use your characters to show their point of view of that specific theme. For instance, love. One character might absolutely agree with the aspect of love. It's a wonderful thing. But then another character might say love stinks because you can be completely heartbroken. And if you use that in dialogue, then you can let your characters conclude their own opinion on it instead of your own, the author's. So it can be a little bit more meaningful.
Or to angle that a little bit, rather than love, redemption.
Redemption.
If your theme is redemption, you're going to have to show characters intending things that are not great, then possibly experiencing the emotions of guilt or regret, and being redeemed by choosing to do better, having a different intention. One of the things that when you talk about characters in story writing and story acts, generally a story act is understood as a point where the intentions of characters in the story changes and can't go back to the previous thing. It must go forward into a new chapter, into a new section.
Yes, and to add one more point to this, dialogue is one of the most powerful ways of showing character emotion, and I think that's one of the best ways as to why it can be, purposeful dialogue should be relevant. I personally believe that using dialogue is more powerful than using prose to show a character's emotion because it's in their voice. They stutter, they might choke up, and you can really tell if you write dialogue well that their voice is, choked up. So that could be very, very, very strong to move the plot forward as well.
Yeah, you kind of use those things like rainbow dash, choked out. It's all of those terrible little adverbs that people say, oh, never use anything but said. We're not sure that you should never use anything but said. There's room for a lot of different ways to do this.
So are we talking about tags now?
We're bouncing all over the place. We may end up having time for plenty of questions if we go super fast.
Yes, speaking of tags, when it comes to emotions, normally, if you, how many people in here read? Just put your hand up. I'm guessing all of you. Of course, yeah.
Yay.
That's sort of a silly rhetorical question, but normally when you read stories, you probably see other dialogue tags being used other than said and asked, like cried, snapped, barked, so on. I can go on and on. There's a million different dialogue tags that are out there. However, when you apply those tags like shouted, yelled, cried, what you are essentially doing is you are telling the reader how the character has said that specific line of dialogue. Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. Remember the rule show don't tell? That whole rule contradicts that rule, and essentially what you're doing is you're telling the reader how the character is saying it, when realistically the reader should conclude how the character is saying it because of how well you should be writing the dialogue.
Now I have to bounce off of that because there are times when telling isn't a no-no, and telling isn't a no-no when you're trying to get something out of the way that you're not supposed to focus on.
That is very true. Telling, don't get the misconception.
It's a no-no in certain places.
Yes.
There is a fine line.
Sometimes telling is absolutely
and
essential.
That's why we're spelling it out very overtly there, in that the deal with telling versus showing, the deal with sticking these things in there rather than illustrating them through more encompassing ways of doing stuff is one, if you want to get that data point out of the way and you're not supposed to be having the reader focusing on it. It's like, okay, take this as read, we're actually looking here. And
not only that too, but when you use other tags instead of ask, I'm not saying that you can't use other tags instead of ask in dialogue text, because you absolutely can. The only problem is when the writer does it too many times, and what happens is that the reader gets attention to the dialogue tag and not the dialogue itself.
Too many times can also be redundantly.
Very redundant.
Twilight sparkle, lavender to lavenderly.
Yeah, it can
we already knew that. It's very obvious, Oh my God! Rainbow Dash yelled. It's like, yeah, we noticed that she's yelling.
And please, for the love of God, do not always have said in every single line of dialogue tag. Twilight said, Rainbow said, Applejack said, Twilight said,
it's
over and
invisible
over
to
again.
most people. It's not invisible to everybody. I've talked to somebody that's very con.
I agree and disagree with that, because if you have said too many times, right, in the wrong places, it can be very noticeable. Though, incidentally, said and asked are more invisible than other tags that stick out.
Well, one of the things about it is that when you're using said all the time, assuming that it's invisible, it's going to bring the overall tone down into this sort of normalcy zone. It's going to bring the tone down into like, okay, said, nothing too exciting must be happening because it's not being highlighted in any ways. To my mind, the use of dialogue tags in the funny way, the whispered, inquired, snapped, snorted, all of that kind of stuff, if it's novel and interesting and still works, it's like the difference between lightning and the lightning bug, as I think Mark Twain said. it's possible to use dumb, boring attribution tags or repetitively, and I always watch out for stuff that's coming across repetitively, whether it's dialogue tags or not. Anything that echoes, whether it's a form of commenting, any type of phrase, the length of a sentence, you basically want to have stuff changing up. And I'll consciously change stuff up and throw things in just to make it novel, just to break patterns that seem to be emerging.
You do, and I want to add one more point to this too. I have read many stories before with very ambiguous, unclear dialogue tags, and I have had to sometimes look up the definition of a dialogue tag. And if you find yourself doing that, then you have lost all credibility for the dialogue. You have literally put more focus on one word than the dialogue, and that is what the objective here is. You have to be able to write the dialogue that will grasp the reader and have the reader's attention.
I mean, my favorite situation with the tags is if I can come up with something that's novel and interesting and really says what's not being said in the dialogue and what would not be said by another attribution tag. And that's a tricky way. It's like writing poetry. You have said, sighed, yelled, all that kind of stuff. But if something's a little bit unexpected but perfectly illuminates what you're after, it's always forgivable.
It is.
It needs to say something of its own.
Sometimes you can just use other tags. Sometimes it's more fitting than said and asked because you just want to convey something. But just don't do it every single time. Use it with limitations.
Or don't use them at all.
That too.
We have another thing that we're talking about, which is when you don't have to use the dialogue tags at all.
Yes.
Fragments. Those little bits of dialogue, this guy knows about them, and this person knows about them, where you don't even have to put the dialogue tag at all. You have to have things organized so you know who's talking. You
just have your quote, your dialogue, period, quote, closing quotation mark, next line.
And Admiral Biscuit brought a additional layer of depth and interest to this very conversation, in a conversation in Quills and Sofas, showing examples of when you could have multiple unattributed dialogue and you don't care who said them because they're crowd dialogue. And that hadn't actually even occurred to me.
That is very true, actually. Yes, unattributed dialogue. Normally, when you have already identified who is the speaker, especially if there's two people speaking, you should see a pattern. If Twilight speaks first, as Twilight said, and then Applejack talks, then you know that the next pony who's going to be talking is more than likely Twilight, unless Rainbow Dash, of course, just like magically appears out of thin air. She is.
Well, through the window, perhaps.
Through the window, perhaps.
It seems magical until you have to fix the window.
Or through the Golden Oak Library, crashing to the ceiling. But yes, unattributed dialogue, it reduces the repetition instead of using multiple tags as well. But you have to be careful because if you use unattributed dialogue too much, you fall into a pit what's called talking heads. And what talking heads are is when you have strings of dialogue that are just floating. You may know who is speaking, but what are they doing? When you're speaking and talking to someone, you're fidgeting with something more than likely. You're walking, you're drinking something, you're playing with the ring on your finger, you're moving your hands around a gesture. So you should really incorporate what's called action beats, which is more of a fun way of incorporating who is speaking. Because normally whoever is doing the action is more than likely the speaker, as long as it's connected to the string of dialogue, that is.
It gets into that regularity thing. It gets into the trying to avoid boring patterns showing up and being annoying. Because if you are having a long string of unattributed dialogue and you expect people to remember exactly who's talking, it almost is forced to be a regular pattern and just boring and it's repeating, otherwise it wouldn't work. So it's a balance there.
Unless it's something like Applejack where like it's where it's extremely noticeable. But that's extremely conditional and situational, because depending on your character, if they have a noticeable pattern on how he or she speaks, then it can be very hard for the reader to keep track of who is speaking with the unattributed dialogue.
It certainly is, darling. You see,
Or sugar cube.
Yeah, sugar cube. With the unattributed dialogue, it's extra sensitive to little cues that might suggest one pony or the other, and that's something that can trip you up sometimes. If you've got stuff going on where we're going to have a dedicated question and answer section at the end. We're probably going to get to it and have lots and lots of time.
We will.
It's hypersensitive to having little cues that seem to indicate one pony or another. So if you're doing a bunch of unattributed dialogue and intend for it to be read as specific characters, that's when you fall most heavily into the, like, what does this suggest? Which character does this suggest? And even bouncing back out of the unattributed and throwing in some dialogue tags just to ground people. That's something that I will often do. I'll find places to sneak it in there.
Now that is, of course, if there are, I'll just add on one more point, incidentally. If there are only two characters in the scene and you sneak in a direct address, like, I don't think so, Twilight, then that can be a clear indication that, that the next person who is going to be speaking, or pony, is going to be Twilight. And then you can do that very cleverly. You can use direct addresses to passively show who is speaking, assuming that there are only two characters in the scene. When you get more than two characters, it can get a little confusing on who is speaking.
Yeah, I mean,
in particular.
Twilight and Rainbow Dash talking, and then one of the unattributed sentences is, well, if you're an egghead, then you can kind of tell who said that.
Yeah, or for Rainbow Dash, would be, for Twilight, it would be Featherbrains.
Is this a good time for us to drift on to the little run-ons example?
Yes, run-ons. Yes.
I snuck a thing in here which the sentence fragments and run-ons sometimes grossly violate normal rules of language.
But when you write dialogue, you can say
dialogue
you can just throw all grammatical and syntax rules outside the window.
You can get away with anything. Applejack, you can get very, very countryish. Go back and rewatch season 1 if you want to get reminded of how countryish you can be. And all kinds of other crazy stuff. I had a scene with Savoir-Faire, and he was a French waiter pony. And I decided that I wanted to write him in English using a very, very, very French word use. I'm not sure exactly what the word is for the way you construct sentences. It's like the way that German speech has the verb at the end, sometimes a string of verbs at the end. And if you have not natural English language speakers, you can have some very interesting constructions. I had Savoir-Faire saying a tragic look crossed the waiter's face. Monsieur, when you go to the embracing of the cow pony Brayburn, it is to remember the kindness extended by me, and even after or before the paying of the bill, to take mercy upon the one who, in a spirit of loving pony kindness, sent you freely and with liberty on your way. In French, that would be natural and idiomatic, because the way it's constructed, it goes on all the comma things, and it's very naturally lends itself to just stringing itself on. People who learn to speak French in a natural and idiomatic way have to pick up stuff like that. And so if you're doing a foreign language speaker who is speaking English somewhat haltingly, the construction can get very strange and interesting.
And this is probably one of my favorite things. Because when we speak sometimes, depending on how we're feeling with our emotions, and again, it all connects back to how your character is feeling. Depending on how you are, whether you're angry, sad, sometimes when we speak, we go on forever without ever taking a pause, without ever realizing that we can take a full stop for 1 second and take a breather. But that's what dialogue is. So it should be applied to storytelling as well. Sometimes you can just say, I don't need commas in this dialogue at all. I just will have a run-on sentence with no conjunctions, no commas, no semicolons, no dashes, no punctuation. Because that essentially indicates that either A, a character is ranting, or B, a character is very upset. Like what I was just doing right now, I was just rambling, essentially.
We've got a little bit in here about comma splices within dialogue and why they're your friend.
Yeah.
That sounds like the run-on kind of rambling.
Yeah, it does. Comma splices. I have two reasonings for this. Is because commas, if you know grammar, commas are very slight breaks, slight pauses in sentences and clauses. But when you have things like semicolons, they're a much harder break. Harder break than a comma, but a less of a break than a period. And when you have commas, comma splices in particular, it makes the sentences flow or clauses flow in the dialogue a lot more easily. And that essentially makes the readability of it a lot more enjoyable for the reader. Because when you start putting in semicolons in there, it can sound a bit too formal and a little bit too structured. And that's the last thing you want with dialogue, because dialogue is very loose when you consider its structure.
And God help you if you have periods. It sounds like you're being lectured at.
Yeah, it does.
In fact,
you can.
we have a demonstration.
You can
Start off with the type of thing we're using, and I will deliver the line of dialogue. He loved you, he really did, but you don't care. It'll sound different each time. So firstly, no punctuation at all.
Oh yeah, no punctuation at all.
He loved you, he really did, but you don't care.
He loved you, he really did, but you don't care.
Now the normal thing would be commas. He loved you, he really did, but you don't care. Little pause there.
And the semicolon one is, he loved you, he really did, but you don't care.
Then we get on to M dashes. It starts getting longer and longer, and you can mix all of these up like, man, he loved you, he really did, but you don't care.
See, the problem with M dashes in particular is that they indicate very strong breaks in sentences, and if you have those in dialogue, sometimes it can be very, very, very hindering.
They're very good at parentheticals.
They are.
They feel like parentheticals.
They are. So you have to be careful when you use those in particular.
Okay, now don't wait for longer than 5 minutes for the ellipsis demonstration. That's it. Huh?
Yeah. He loved you. He really did. But you don't care.
Yeah. Ellipsis, everybody's favorite dialogue trick for when you don't know actually what you're saying, so you're trying to make the character wait until you think of something to say. Never do this. You don't have to live that way. It's terrible. But yeah, these varying these things is super useful. You know, like I said, periods can be, you know, he loved you, he really did, but you don't care. The periods can be very clipped and carpet. If that's what you're trying to convey, it's perfect. You know, the varying of these things, since you have so much more flexibility than in just ordinary narrative, using these punctuations are very interesting. The only semicolons are not your friend unless you're Rarity or Luna or Princess Celestia. They just convey so much uptightness that it's a very dangerous game. Some characters should never speak in semicolons.
Like Pinkie Pie.
That would be really disturbing.
That would be extremely disturbing.
Unless
it's Pinkamena,
Pinkie Pie's brain has been taken over by something, and that's the dead giveaway. And the scary thing is, none of the other ponies really can know what happens because they don't see the semicolons in her dialogue.
You might have to.
But she probably is breaking the fourth wall and is reading her own dialogue and going, "Why am I talking like this?"
You might have to attach a alternate universe tag on that.
Yeah, Pinkie Pie, semicolons, happily. Pinkie Pie knows punctuation periods? Pinkie Pie speaks in periods, periodly, or curtly. Theoretically, yep. Theoretically, she'd be perfectly okay to talk happily in this. Let's get over to that little piece of word, ly.
Oh, yeah.
Adverbs versus actions.
Oh, adverbs, joy.
People may say you should avoid using these at all costs.
Even Stephen King says that, and there's a quote by his book called On Writing, and I do recommend you give that a read. It's very good. But one of the quotes in that book is, the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and I would rather die than to use adverbs and dialogue attribution.
I'd correct that a little bit. The road to hell is paved with expected adverbs. Again, you can do great things using adverbs if they're a little distinct, if they're not what the reader's obviously expecting, if they cast a new light onto things that helps you move along. It's just, you know, when that stuff comes to you, it'll be fairly obvious because it's not, you know, the traditional adverb that you would automatically use. Automatic adverbs is never a good idea.
And incidentally, a lot of the older writers back in like the 900s and up until maybe the 2000s have used adverbs and dialogue tags with great succession for their stories. One of the reasons why you are generally frowned upon using adverbs with dialogue attribution is because you're essentially telling, again, the reader how the character is specifically saying what he or she had said. And sometimes when you use adverbs, it can clutter up certain areas. And generally speaking, you want to be able to sort of omit the adverb, but sometimes no matter how good of a dialogue writer you are, you sometimes cannot convey what you want to get across. So you need to have that adverb just to give that extra to get your point across.
The thing about what gets you with the adverbs is, again, that repeating patterns thing. Patterns showing up in the writing and it doesn't have anything to do with what you're saying. What'll kill you with adverbs every time is when they end with "ly." It's easy to start hearing the echoing of "ly," 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 and all these different dialogue tags. It's always, something "ly," something "ly," something "ly," and it gets really old. It echoes very obviously.
And it can, and the thing with the adverbs too is that it can dilute the other words around them too. Mm-hmm. It can really drag it down.
Sometimes it's very useful to do, but when you need to use something like that, just watching the way that they're echoing, watching the patterns that form up, and just sneaking out the extra stuff where it's redundant, where it's not needed, where you can get away with leaving one out so that you have another one in different places. It's like, okay, I want to have my adverb here, so I'd better leave one out here and here, otherwise it's going to start echoing like crazy and being really obnoxious.
Yeah, I think we've all been, I think it's safe to say for the most part that we have used an adverb with a dialogue tag at one point. It's not a bad thing. Just
hopefully.
Just don't do it too often. Do it when you have to.
Or do it because that's your style and you want to annoy everybody.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, style is very interesting.
It is. Everyone has a very different style when it comes to dialogue.
Well, the interesting thing about it is that the characters have different styles coming to dialogue too. That's getting on to the advanced level of dialogue.
Yes, very advanced.
Yeah, that's what this panel is all about. I have that one example, but have you got other examples?
Talk about actions really quick? Or?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Actions, yes. Actions. Action beats. I think I covered this a little bit ago.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
But I'll just go into a little bit more detail very concisely. When it comes to actions are very, very, very fun to do. Some depending on the writer you are, sometimes you will just omit the dialogue tags completely and just use action. And the reason why action is very, very, very good to incorporate in your dialogue is because it's showing your character is alive and not standing there talking like a dummy. Because when you have characters interacting with objects, you know that their material world is in fact real. And that can also set up the setting too of things and your world, your fictional world too.
I'll go rescue everything. Rainbow Dash flew through the window.
And glass shattered all over the place, leaving Twilight annoyed.
You know that was Dash talking because it's immediately in the same sentence of a Dash action.
Yes.
You can break up the sentence fragments with actions, and it's just as good as a dialogue tag.
Exactly. But just like anything else in writing, you have to be careful how often you use action beats. If you use too many, it can hinder your story.
Yeah, it's
like
the echoing thing.
It's the echoing thing. It can be very noticeable. Absolutely.
Yeah, so when you're getting the, if you've got dialogue tags, you know to use those. You know that you can still use said. Sometimes you can use said a lot if it's a little boring and nothing much is happening. You know you can use the unattributed dialogue fragments when it's pretty clear who's talking. You know you can throw in the action beats in between sentence fragments and that tie stuff. The most important thing, and this is actually from John Gardner, it's another, John Gardner on Becoming a Novelist is just as good as the Stephen King book. It's a little more specific and it's a little less popular. The idea is that when you're writing, using all these tools together, the most important thing is communicating with great obviousness exactly what needs to be known at any given moment. And it's not necessarily what needs to be known as the most boring expression of anything. What needs to be known is like, this moment is exciting, this thing happened, this person is angry talking to that person, and so on and so forth. Any given moment, there should be one way to arrange the sentence that is best.
For example, sometimes you can have the dialogue first and then the action beat. And sometimes it's better to have the action beat before the line of dialogue. It all depends on the situation, really.
Yeah, but there's always going to be a clear preference, most likely.
Most likely.
It's going to be like, okay, this line clearly wants to have this action be stuck in between there, which means I don't have to use said or anything like that because it's going to be clear. And then it goes on to another type, a reaction, and we can put the, well, that was interesting, and then tie that to the character that's speaking as well. That was interesting, said Twilight, and go on, because her emotion, isn't, well, that was interesting, screamed Twilight. It's not that big of a reaction. It can use said because said is kind of boring. It's fairly invisible, and it moves on. It reads through very seamlessly.
Sometimes I've read somewhere too that a lot of readers just skip over said when they see it. Like once they see essay, they just skip right over and continue on. Yeah. Just please do not use a tag like grinned, laughed, or smiled, because those I have very, very strong opinions with those, and I'm not going to rant about them because time. But I will say this: words do not grin, words do not laugh, nor words do not dance. I have seen a dialogue tag Rarity danced, and when I saw that, I just had to close the story. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be I don't mean to be savage or put you on the spotlight,
yes,
but
you do.
I do. I have every intention of being savage.
But yeah, I mean, these are.
But when you have ambiguous tags like that, it's a little ridiculous.
I would take it as you'd better damn well justify them.
Yes.
Like if it's like Applejack laughed,
make that into an attribute.
You would have to. I mean, my take on that particular construction is that only works after the dialogue that you've done, because it's filling the little thing.
You could say Applejack said, laughing shortly after. You could say that, or you can just say Applejack laughed, period.
No, I would take it as like, oh, come on, Sugar Cube, Applejack laughed.
Oh, okay.
But it wouldn't feel right if it was like Applejack laughed, ha ha ha, and then said something else. There's so many easy ways for that one to go horribly wrong, and that's probably why you're reacting.
Yes.
I had a little bit of characterization dialogue from Applejack. We can burn through that, and then we're going to be wandering without a map and have no outline at all.
Yay.
But unless you explain what this meant.
Yes.
But the funny thing about the flow of dialogue and the way different characters are different is you develop an ear for like regionalisms, accents, things like that. I tried very hard to come up with good examples of a native German speaker speaking kind of stiltedly with some semicolons and putting the verbs at the end. I never really managed to do that. And my savoir-faire example is kind of awkward and exaggerated, but it was exaggerated for a reason. I wanted to make him seem very, very foreign. And Applejack drawl is a special interesting problem because she's main sex, not a background pony, thank you very much. And
Rarity's a background pony.
Started off in the first season with a very striking accent. And it's a drawl, and drawls work in certain ways. The way a drawl works is all the word choices, whether they're grammatical or not, flow with the least amount of stiltedness and work on the voice track's part. Distinguish this from like Rarity or especially Twilight. Twilight would scrutinize the situation of a thing to determine you're hearing all the bumpiness of that. It's a lot of work going on in the vocal track.
That's another thing too. Is when we speak to people, unless you're a very verbose, reader, bookworm, chances are you're not going to be using very, very, very big words. And when you use that in dialogue, it can work to some extent. However, if the reader is having problems reading it, then chances are the characters are stumbling as well. Because when we speak, we mostly speak in fragments. And we don't speak in complete sentences all the time, and we don't always use our large vocabularies, because when we sit down to write, we have like an on switch on our brain. It's like we're in vocabulary writing mode. But when we go speak to people, we turn that switch off, and we use sort of our more colloquial, informal vocabulary to make it easier for the reader to read.
I mean, with a drawl, that's more delivery than anything else. Like I have my little example, I cut it down slightly. It's from a not too intense story that I've written. And it is a Applejack in a Big Macintosh story who in this story is sort of very much a hard driver, very capable and successful, and also a real motor mouth this time around. But she still has the drawl and she still has the Applejackisms. And the first sentence could be read like, and another thing, you're telling me they got their garden broke up into little plots, with barbed wire? How they gonna rotate seed crops like that? I always thought them Applelusons were crazy. And of course it doesn't sound anything like Applejack. But a drawl blurs everything into everything else. And if you select words so that they can do that, you get, and another thing, you're telling me they got their garden broke up into little plots with barbed wire? How they going to rotate seed crops like that? I always thought them Appaloosans were crazy, but until I seen it, I wouldn't believed it. With all them orchards, they ain't left room for other stuff. Ponies cannot live on apples alone, and that's me seeing it, you hear? They'll all get colic. I can't go straighten them out, Big Macintosh. You got to go back there and teach them how to do this. It just flows into everything else. If you can make the drawl stuff smoothly, how they gonna rotate seed crops like that becomes, how they gonna rotate seed crops like that? And it's people have trouble with Applejack if it's just y'all, 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 y'all all the time, because any Southerner will tell you don't call one person y'all. Y'all is basically multiple people. And when I sneak it into addressing one person, usually what I'm going to do is blur it so heavily you can't even hear it as y'all. It could sound almost like you, and it's all the delivery.
That's the beautiful thing about characterization too, is every character, even your original characters, whether you branch off out of fan fiction too, have a distinctive way of speaking. Mm-hmm. And depending on how you write your character, it can be a dead giveaway on who is speaking. That's when you're getting into something a little bit more complex. But generally speaking, if you compare Fluttershy's dialogue to Pinkie Pie's dialogue, Fluttershy is going to be a little bit more passive, humble, a little bit more quieter, while Pinkie Pie is going to be energetic, crazy, and just wild, right? So you have to consider that. You have to hold the dialogue true to your character. And the way I look at it is, if you ever write first-person narration, you're writing in a character's voice. So think of it as if you're writing a long stream of dialogue, but it isn't dialogue, it's essentially prose. Because the way you would write first person is the way you would write their dialogue, but within reason. There are some restrictions. So you have to consider that as well.
Yeah, and dialogue can be a beautiful thing in that way. You can go from the sort of a scene with the drawling, Applejack or whatever, and then go, Spike, please address the neutron flow of the magical fluxes, and it's Twilight talking.
Yes.
Because it's all sort of crisp and arranged and so on, and it's using the kinds of words that she would use. And you can hear her enunciating everything very clearly.
And it's like Fluttershy. It's like, I don't think we're supposed to do that. What do you think?
Come on, Fluttershy, live a little. Yeah, and you got Rainbow Dash.
And you got Rainbow Dash. Too. Plus, with Fluttershy, you just have a bunch of ellipses all over the place. So that's a dead giveaway too.
Maybe if some pony wasn't flying around getting her wings all dirty all the time. That's actually half Fluttershy and half Rarity now that I think of it.
And Rarity too is, the main six, since they have very good characterizations, it can be noticeable on who's speaking, obviously. But with Rarity, it's very, extravagant and exaggerated. She uses words like extravagant, marvelous, darling, those are the subtle things that can give away.
If all her dialogue is Rarity said, it's not going to sound much like Tabitha St. Germain. She's exploding with adverbs in every direction. What did you have for amounts of dialogue?
Amounts of dialogue.
Relative to narrative?
Relative to narrative, yes. Okay. You wanna be able to balance things out, because when you write a story, of course, you want to have a balance of things. You don't want to have too much dialogue, too much prose, depending on the story you're writing. If you're a writer like H.P. Lovecraft that doesn't include dialogue at all, and you just have prose, then that works. But it's dependent on your story. Some stories have more dialogue than it does prose. But you want to find that niche. You want to find that balance of when to tell your characters to shut up. And sometimes it is true. It is very true. Sometimes when I'm writing, my characters don't want to shut up, and it can be the hardest thing to stop them from talking.
Oh, I mean, this is great. You're like, yay, I have another couple thousand words, right? Like that.
Yeah.
But you haven't put any orientation in. You haven't put any background in. It's nothing but these characters talking, and either they're exciting and interesting, or they're talking heads. But you're like, I've written a half a chapter and there's nothing but dialogue here.
That does happen to me. But one easy way to fix that, incidentally, is sticking a paragraph of prose in their narration, trying to build that paragraph off of the idea of what was said before. And then what you could do is you could include a line of dialogue in the same paragraph, and then have the character express what he or she was thinking. I mean, that's a good way to incorporate some things, or you could just literally just do a scene transition, say later that night, depending on how the conversation went.
Another thing you can do is
do a scene transition. That could be a great way of doing it instead of staying on the same scene. Because when you do a scene transition, that means that A, the conversation has obviously ended, or B, they just fought to the death and someone died.
Another thing to do is consider it to be the proscenium. You're on a blank stage, and only thing to care about is the actors. So just keep all of the dialogue and don't worry about filling in any of the background because you're that concerned about what's happening in the dialogue and what's happening in the characterization. Never assume you need to fill in backstory and world building and paragraphs of narrative just in order to make it a good story, because very likely the most important thing is being carried by the dialogue if you naturally follow the dialogue.
That's the thing too with dialogue, because dialogue, like, that's one of the main functions of dialogue, is it reveals new information about the plot. So realistically, you could move the plot forward using dialogue. You don't necessarily have to use narration.
I'll go back to the beginning and say that it moves the intentions of characters,
as well,
which is what the plot is constructed out of. Because people will think plot is like, okay, and this happens, and then that happens, and then that happens, and then that happens. But if you know why they're making it happen, it gains a lot of traction.
Exactly. And to carry on the phantom piece of our outline, I just wanted to say on an unrelated topic,
the phantom outline.
Just watch movies. Watch soap operas. I, as silly as it sounds, I do watch one soap opera, The Young and the Restless. It's been on for like 42 years. But I watch it and I pay attention to how the characters speak. I think that's one of the, it doesn't necessarily have to be MLP. It can be movies. When you pay attention to how script is written, it's all dialogue. So watch a good film, watch a soap opera, cheesy it is, just watch television, watch something that's scripted, because when you have a good grasp of dialogue, then you can point out, hey, that shouldn't have been said like that, or that could have been done better. And it can really help you. It can really bolster your dialogue writing skills as well.
That is a great suggestion, because that's one of the trickiest things about screenwriting, the fact that if you're screenwriting, you have only dialogue and what can be seen
strictly dialogue
on the screen.
It's stage directing.
There's no narrative at all.
There's no narrative at all.
But, it's we show this and these people say this.
Yes. So soap operas in particular, I find great because, well, depending on which
characterization.
One, characterization as well.
That's all they are.
That's all they are. They're just characterization, and they're up there doing their thing. And the reason why is because usually it's on every single day, and you can tell when there's a new writer. Writing the scripts, it can be very noticeable. And this is where you can get into the distinction between dialogue styles, how things are written, how often do characters use adjectives within their dialogue as well. So it's just subtle things like that.
And some of us write ponies and turn them into soap operas.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
We might be able to start taking questions.
Yes, we have plenty of time for Q&As if anyone has
so
Q&A.
We're going to have somebody come up and handle the microphone so that the questioner, you're right ahead of us. Excellent, well done.
All right, beautiful.
We've got a little bit less than 20 minutes, so we can start taking questions from the audience on dialogue, if you please.
Don't be shy. We won't bite.
Be shy if you want. Be Fluttershy. We'll love that.
Just Fluttershy right there, actually.
And bear in mind, we are experienced panelists, so don't get frisky with us. We know what we're doing. Now all the dialogue is happening in the line.
Yes, it is. Some good dialogue.
It's always very challenging to have dialogue when people don't have words.
I'm going to say this too. Pay attention to how people speak. Eavesdrop on conversations, but do it within reason, as creepy as that sounds, because when you pay attention to how people speak, I know it's a little weird and strange, but seriously, pay attention to people's conversations, particularly your families, because I'm, not strangers, and see how they speak, and then you can take that for what you will.
Yeah, for a while there, we had the dialogue of Pinkie Pie without a mouth over here.
Oh.
So I think we have the microphone, do we?
Do we?
Good, okay, onward.
Real quick before we start, please keep the questions PG, and in the interest of getting to as many questions as we can, please, if you have anything to add to the discussion, hold on to it, and we will our panelists will be happy to discuss it with you at Quills and Sofas.
Yep.
I'll be there.
As always, we can always go on at great length in Quills and Sofas.
Yes, I'll be there for a bit today.
So earlier you said that laughed is not something that you should try and use. Are there exceptions to that?
Laughed as an adverb.
Laughed.
Laughed as a dialogue attribution.
Yeah, like so. For example, like I don't think that's the way that works. Rainbow Dash. Twilight laughed, because when we speak, words don't laugh. We say words, right? It would be very hard to laugh while saying something. I mean, we can.
It's tricky because you could do the like, oh, come now, sugar cube, and you don't get to write the shaking of the voice into that.
That would be incredibly hard to do.
Laugh. But if you said, Applejack laughed, come on, let's all go over here, that just reads dumb. Laughed is more easy to make wrong. It doesn't sound right unless you have a line that already sounds kind of laughy, and then you're just sort of doubling it up, and then doubling it up is not great either.
Okay, so thank you.
It's just harder to use that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
I noticed in a lot of fan fiction that most of the stories are about 70% dialogue. Is it even worth it to write a story that's more like general fiction that's like 5% dialogue?
It depends on what your story is and how you want to write your story. If you're like H.P. Lovecraft, that's very suspenseful and weird, and you want the reader to feel in place of the story, and have the character show his or her own characterization without dialogue, then that will work beautifully without dialogue. However, if you want to have characters engage with each other and you want to show character development between two conflicting characters that don't like each other, then dialogue would be suitable. A lot of dialogue would be suitable for that.
Yeah, you could go and ask Bad Horse, is it possible to have a story without dialogue, and have an hour-long conversation on that subject, because you get experimental enough and anything is possible.
I've written one story without dialogue at all.
Is it good in this form? Does this story need to be this way? That's basically what you need to think of.
Yes, you have to.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
On the topic of dialogue tags, or rather things to use in place of dialogue tags, the styles of dialogue, what's the best way to approach going back and forth, or maybe, like, I forget what you called it, like writing in an action in place of
an action beat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Using things like that, but going back and forth between them, but keeping the transition not feeling like a...
Don't worry about that at first, just start going back and forth between them. Start throwing stuff together, and then in retrospect you'll see whether it was comfortable, and learn from that and move onwards. The important thing is include that stuff. Find ways to put it in. Don't worry too hard about whether it's all balancing out perfectly. It's about what you're saying rather than the details of how you're saying it.
Don't put too much emphasis on that. Just do what you have to do to get the point across.
Thanks.
You'll be golden.
And write more. Always write more.
Always. Write more dialogue.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not much we can do about that. You can print it down a little bit.
You might have to like...
Okay. Anyway, as I was going to be asking, you said that at certain points that in order to have good dialogue, you need to make sure that your characters have a distinct voice in between, so you're not always saying he said, she said, all back and forth. How exactly would you use this concept or any other writing concept in order to do that with multiple characters, like up to 5 or more characters all talking to each other?
Good question.
5 characters talking is a lot of work.
That is extremely tough, because you have to consider why you have those 5 characters together. What I would say is apply an action beat every once in a while with a dialogue tag. So mix it up, so you would have maybe 2 action beats and 1 dialogue tag, and then another action beat. 5 characters that can be tough to do.
They usually have a movie-like approach of 5 characters.
That's hard.
2 of them become the focus. The other ones tactfully step back, even if it has nothing to do with what they would be doing, because it's like a movie, and they have to step back so we can show the ones that are talking.
Speaking of that,
It doesn't have to be realistic so much as it has to flow and be readable. Yeah. So yeah, I would have if you have 5 characters, a bunch of them are going to have to sit in the closet while the other ones talk.
Yeah,
and we never mentioned that. They just come back out when we need them.
That's a good question, though. Hello.
It's me, be afraid. So my question has to do, because you guys mentioned with Applejack, her sort of phonetic accent and how that's usually written with AH for eyes and
that's
the
dangerous.
contracted stuff. It is dangerous, but what I've seen lots of scripts and stuff, because I work in theater, that use phonetic accents for whatever reason. There's an extended one I forget the name of the comedian, but the script is called Escanaba in the Moonlight, and the whole thing is written in this upper peninsula of Michigan drawl, and it's really hard to read. But it's what advantage? There are many disadvantages to using phonetic accents. We all know that, but what are some advantages of using it? Because obviously, it's an advantage when we're talking about Applejack.
I think it's entirely dependent on your character and whether or not your character is, for example, German, Chinese, Italian.
And if it matters.
And if it matters too, if you want to put emphasis on that. Writing with an accent can be extremely difficult to do because you have
distracting.
And distracting as well. And sometimes, depending if you're a foreign writer, to native speakers of English, it can be very hard to read an accent, depending on what kind of accent it is.
Right.
So it's really dependent on mainly your character, whether it matters and whether or not it works with your character or not.
I mean, there's a lot of importance and power to having characters with very different, distinct viewpoints. I mean, our first point was dialogue is a way of showing characters have multiple viewpoints. So if you've got like Applejack and Rarity, and it's important that Applejack is the funky country pony and stuff, and Rarity is the uptight fashionista with semicolons, then you can have their dialogue constantly flagging that they see things differently and have different attitudes about stuff. It's a very useful way to indicate things like that.
Very much so.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So kind of jumping off that, I want to ask if it perhaps too ambitious or such to take it a step further and actually use a foreign language in your writing to like actually characterize either one character or a relationship with another character. So he would go up to somebody, just see him on the street, ask them where they're from, don't get a response, but then he'd try again and say something like, "Gdizvi," and then they get a response and they'd say, "Yai's," from wherever they're from. Like, is that, like trying to carry out the story, that perhaps be too ambitious, maybe pretentious?
I have read a detective novelist, Dorothy Sayers. If anybody knows Dorothy Sayers, raise your hand. Probably not, but yay, there's a few Peter Wimsey readers. And Dorothy Sayers managed to include French and Latin, I think it's Latin, in her actual books, including for heated emotional romantic climaxes. And she would drop into foreign languages while writing English language. This is kind of pretentious. You might not want to do that. She got away with it because she's Dorothy Sayers and she was kind of awesome. But be aware that you're taking a big chance and you're trading stuff off. You're saying to a large proportion of readers, I don't care if you understand the ending of my book. I don't care if you understand this part that I'm doing. And that's a little uncool. I would not personally do that without pointedly translating it in some way, even if it was just contextually.
Or through the character's response to that?
Sure. Anything to get around the problem of, I've just done foreign language that you don't understand, na-na-na-na-na. Hi.
Hello. This isn't something that I've seen in a lot of fan fiction, but I've seen it happen once or twice. What do you think of colored text to signify who's speaking?
Don't ever do that.
I've only seen fonts used once.
I'm just going to say this right now. When it comes to typography, do not ever color text unless you're trying to emphasize something. Because when you have colored text, you're drawing the reader's attention to the color.
And not the content. I have only seen this used well once. The cyberpunk writer Pat Cadigan wrote a story about a character with massive split personality disorder, which is part of the plot of the book, in which entire chapters are written in one font and other entire chapters are written in another font, and she starts having an emotional breakdown, and when things start going sideways, you see individual words in the other font, and it is absolutely chilling and relevant to the point being made in the book. So I've only seen that done well once, and even that, it's like a stunt. It's such a stunt. You're going to distract people.
You're going to heavily distract people.
What book? That book would be, oh, the White Box. Yep, there's been pony versions of that as well. I didn't say, I was thinking of published books being done. White Box has done that, yes.
All right.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
that's the
Yes.
answer. Oh yeah, people can be colorblind too. All right, next question.
Next person.
Hi. I kind of have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is when you're punctuating yelling, if you already have exclamation points, is it overkill to
Yes.
capitalize?
5 exclamation points is a sign of a diseased mind. Terry Pratchett will tell you that.
That is
The more exaggerated you get, it's going to have to be somebody like Pinkie Pie. Otherwise, it's going to seem kind of ridiculous.
you have to be careful with how many exclamation points. I even fall into that pit of using too many in dialogue, but I always revise them.
Like in all caps.
Oh, caps!
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about exclamation points.
Yeah, like is it
Yeah.
overkill? If you write all
My
caps?
1 millionth word in a book series was all caps for a reason. It's possible to all caps, but you better be doing it for a good reason.
For a good reason, and I think an exclamation point would be sufficient enough, because when you have, to me, I'm like a typography fanatic, but when you have capital letters, that's showing a sign of authority, and it's very blocky, and that's sort of putting the lowercase letters around it a little out of place, so it can be distracted to the reader.
Yeah, you'd better save it for really important moments and not use it all the time. Second question? Yeah, Royal Camelot voice, that's a good way.
That's a good way, yeah.
Second question?
Do you have any tips for a dialogue-only story?
I'm sure it's been done. I bet
I'm sure
there's
it's
a bunch
been
of
done.
them. Yep, absolutely it has been. Yeah, in that case, you are talking into your entire landscape is the character intentions and the personalities and what they think and how they see things. There is no external world that they're in. It's all just the context.
Yeah,
Yep, that can be done too.
that can be
Yeah.
done.
All right, next question.
Next question.
Okay, at one point you briefly said there's times you have trouble getting your characters to shut up and you're writing so much dialogue.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there at that time that's not necessarily a bad thing, because does all dialogue have to be functional, or can it be entertaining enough to just write it for its own sake? I know that there's description for its own sake can be beautiful.
Well, what's
if
going to
done
happen
well.
there is that it's going to be like a potato chip thick, and people are like, yay, okay, this really flows, it's cool, I finished it, it didn't go anywhere, it didn't leave me with anything. So there's multiple ways of going about it. I mean, early Terry Pratchett is full of that kind of stuff. Everything he does in early books is like, and then, we're done. And in middle books, he started learning how to take story arcs and point stuff in a direction and go for a purpose, and it became 1,000 times better, which was already pretty good, but it became 1,000 times better. So you can do that, and it limits the scope and depth of the fic that you can do.
Thank you.
Do you have any recommendations for how to best convey tone through dialogue, such as anger, sarcasm, bitterness, stuff that you would say, shouting, things like that?
Periods. Periods are very clipped. Use the periods for stuff that's supposed to be aggressive and harsh.
Like, I, period, told, period, you, period, not, period,
Ooh,
so
that's
on,
a trope.
so on,
That
on
one's
and
a
on.
trope. You have to be darn sure that whether you're using it and not overusing it, because that's a real thing.
That can, it really depends. When you have that sort of situation, you need to think about how you can do it. You have to consider your options. That's all I can say for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend. Some characters might be incredibly clipped and go, no, I don't agree with that, go away if they're angry. And other ones might go on a long rant. Pinkie Pie angry might feign cheerfulness and be like, but you could tell because she just won't shut up and she's just going wild and bonkers on you. It seems innocuous, but something's wrong because she's really relentless about it. It's like when she was annoying Applejack in the cherry farm incident and stuff, and it's like, oh, Jimmy Cherry, Cherry Chonka, Jimmy Cherry, Cherry Chonka. You can tell something's up. It all depends upon the character. Dialogue is out of the character rather than imposed upon the character, so everybody's reactions to showing anger will be different.
And any suggestions for typography, italics, bolds, anything like that, to enhance
when
or
you
keep it
use
as
italics,
Yeah, same as color text and stuff. It's
Same as
like,
color
well,
text,
if
you have
you're
to-
determined to do that, then learn a way to make it comfortable for you.
You-
Some people will choose not to use it.
You use it sparingly because when you use italics, you're putting specific emphasis on that specific word that you're italicizing.
Alrighty.
All right.
All right. How do you avoid making dialogue sounds pretentious? Like, if you want to make a pretentious character, fine, but how do you avoid dialogue coming off as pretentious?
I think you just said it right there. I mean, if you're making a pretentious character, you want their dialogue to sound pretentious. Do you mean
Like-
avoiding characters that aren't supposed to sound
Yeah,
pretentious?
that's what I meant.
Yeah.
You mean like Rainbow Dash? Like
I'm
sounding a bit
trying to think
pretentious?
about what would make a character sound pretentious now. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's my answer. Semicolons. Never use semicolons, and you have a good chance of avoiding pretension.
Yeah.
I'm sure you notice, especially in later seasons, that the show usually throws in a song randomly. How would you incorporate that in a story?
What was it again?
Song.
A song.
Yes.
Incorporating
I would
song.
not. It drives me nuts when I have songs in stories.
I think it would be extremely hard
It's
to
very
do-
difficult to-
I think it would be extremely hard to insinuate the fact that there is a song being played. I don't know how you would do
I'm
that.
pretty sure in film fiction you're not allowed to use other people's songs, and when you make up your own songs, it's always kind of cringeworthy. You know, like, write some stories with non-stop zebra dialogue that's all rhymed and metered before you start trying to write your own songs and sneaking them into stories. It's probably best advice there. And
All right. How would you go about writing internal dialogue?
that is beautiful because that's exactly the same as dialogue, it's pretending to be narrative. I'm constantly doing that. I love doing it, and it's exactly the same as dialogue. You have to be able to attribute it in some way.
You have to. Normally,
And-
you would attribute it with, like, insert character name here, thought.
But
himself.
just like using unattributed dialogue tags, you can drip into a character's internal monologue. In narrative, as long as you're really clear you're doing it, it becomes very obvious, and then you don't randomly bounce out of it. If you go into a Applejack thought, and then all of your narrative is stuff that would have to be coming from Applejack and is clearly fulfilling the characterization of that situation, and then you go to the next dialogue tag and break from that, but you're never going to go from the internal monologue of Applejack to sneak in an authorial narrative. It's got to be one or the other very clearly, just as if you're writing an attributed dialogue in punctuation.
Right. Thank you.
All right, I
All
believe
right,
that
I think
is the
that's a
final
wrap-up.
questioner. Yay!
Thank you very much for attending
Thank you
our
very
panel.
much.
If you have any
Thank you
further
very
questions
much.
for our panelists, you can
If you
find
have
them at
any-
Quills and Sofas, which is right across from Hall of the Moon.
Thank you very much. Wow, we did it.